Hi, I'm Karen Downing Ripley, and I invite you to join me on a recent, unexpected side trip to Brittany, France during the 80th anniversary of the city of Plélo's liberation celebration and learn why Americans and Bretons celebrate their shared DNA from World War II. A last-minute decision to deliver my father's World War II documents to the city of Plélo, France, opened me up to an amazing experience that has truly changed my life. I ask that you join me so that you too can know and appreciate how we Americans are respected and revered because our ancestors fought to liberate the town of Plélo in August 1944. As Plélo's liberation festivities continued, Burt and I began to feel like we were in the midst of World War II, celebrating the original liberation of Plélo in 1944. We began to hear the stories of what had happened not only to the soldiers, but to the families during World War II. I thought about my own family and the profound effect the war had, not only on my father and mother, but on everyone around them. Uncles on all sides of my family went to war. My mom and aunts worked in the factories building the war machines that were to keep their men and democracy alive. It caused me to reflect more deeply on my experiences in Plélo. It gave me an entirely different perspective on how it affected everyone who fought in the war, including my family members. Everyone had sacrificed and had their own version of the Plélo experience and a story about how World War II had impacted their own lives. I look back on all I knew of my own family during the war. I suddenly realized that it just wasn't about my daddy. Everyone had a story, and their stories were all the same, and yet they were all different. Like my Uncle Roger, he joined the Navy, and Uncle Randall served with the Seabees. Uncle Don joined the Army and served at Cassino in Italy. This was one of the longest, bloodiest battles of the war. He never talked about it, but after his death, we found out that he had earned more medals than even Daddy had. Great Uncle Ralph barely survived the sinking of the Indianapolis. He spent days in the sea after his ship went down. The Indianapolis had been totally unprepared as they had just celebrated the end of the war with Japan. The U.S. had dropped atomic bombs, and Japan had surrendered. But lurking in the sea were Japanese sailors who were still at war and delivered the horrendous blow that sunk the Indianapolis. Uncle Ralph had to jump for his life from the ship into the burning sea, and his eyes and skin were burned by the fuel fire that raged on top of the water. He told me how the uninjured men made a big circle, linking hands in the water to keep those injured and hallucinating in the center to try to keep them alive. Because the war was over, no one knew that the Indianapolis had sunk. No one went out to rescue the hundreds of men barely alive and bobbing hopelessly in the sea. Days went by as the South Pacific sun glared down on the sailors as they suffered from injuries, hunger, thirst, and fear for their lives. They waited to be rescued as their Mae West life jackets became waterlogged and they struggled to keep afloat. The injured in the circle began drinking the seawater and became delusional and tried to fight their way out of the center. When the injured thought they could swim to safety and get out of their horrible nightmare, the healthy men had to kick the sick and injured into the center, doing their best to keep them from breaking free to swim to sea in certain death. Sharks began swimming around the men to finish off the job. It was terrifying as the giant monsters would come up and pick off the men, soldier by soldier. Their screams haunted my great-uncle Ralph for the rest of his life. After the war, Uncle Ralph returned to Ohio and raised his family and became a beloved school teacher. My family understood that long after his retirement, Uncle Ralph committed suicide to escape years of excruciating pain and nights of unending horror. During the war, everyone who was left back home did their best to support the troops. American families lived with scarcity and kept the home fires burning, waiting for their boys and girls to return home. My family was fortunate that all of our family members returned. We knew neighbors who had lost their children and husbands and sisters and brothers. Everyone's lives were on hold, and no one knew just for how long.
Hi, my name is Susan Metz. I'm from Kansas. I'm the niece of George Palmateer, who served in Patton's army and was killed in service on August 8th, 1944, near Plélo and Plélo, France. He was a tank driver, and they had gotten through Plélo, but he was ambushed by German tanks. Their whole line was, and some survived, and he didn't. He died that day. I never knew George, and I heard about him through the family because we knew that he served in the war and was killed in the war. He had 3 other brothers who served in World War II, who all came home. And so he was somewhat of a legend. And things that we heard about him is that he was ornery. He loved horses. He was the one who would drive all the younger kids around. And that created a lot of funny stories about getting stuck in the mud while they were on a date to another town. They lived in a very small town in Kansas called Longford, and it's up in north central Kansas. And they lived on farms and worked the fields there until they moved into town. That's where he worked with horses. My grandmother was a widow and had these 8 children for many years, and her only income was what the kids did on the farm, by working on the farm. And when George died, of course, she was given the choice of receiving a lump sum benefit or, getting a benefit monthly. She chose the monthly benefit, and it was a blessing. It was what she lived on for the rest of her life. That's just a little part of the story about what George, how George helped the family besides physically when he was here. My dad was in the Navy. He was stateside in training when George was killed, and got leave to come home for the funeral in this small town. The other brothers were in Europe, and they were brought home for the service. George's body was left. It stayed in France. My grandmother's wishes were for him to stay where he served and died. He was buried in the Brittany Cemetery, but he has a plot in Longford, which is this family plot.
After the war ended, everyone thought everything would go on as it had before the war. No one admitted that many of the boys who had left were not the men who returned. No one spoke of the estrangement caused by the World War II elephant in the room. No one spoke of PTSD.
They did talk about him with much reverence and sadness, but they did not talk a lot about the war. I have 2 uncles who served. One saw a lot of action in the Army. He drove a half-track, and he never spoke of it. Today they would call that the PTSD, because he did not speak about it.
Veterans were expected to pick up their lives where they were left off. My daddy joined my uncles and our families to just go on like nothing had happened to them in surviving the war. Everyone got back to work. No one talked about how the trauma of World War II had changed them. No one wanted to believe that the war changed everybody and everything. How could warriors come home to civilized lives with blood on their hands? The war would always haunt them. It had changed the trajectory of their lives. The war had changed their bodies, their minds, and their relationships with their loved ones. How did the great generation survive World War II trauma? How had it affected us as their descendants? What was life like before divorce, alcoholism, and broken families became common? Post-war families all over the world had the grit and determination to rebuild their world and their lives. They passed on their perseverance and love, and now it's our turn. We must never forget their sacrifice. We must preserve democracy at all costs and tell their stories to honor them and secure a safer world for our descendants. How lucky I was to reunite with my dad and his side of the family, to learn who and why I was. How fortunate I was to experience Plélo and learn so much about my father and myself. I thought about all those who had not been as fortunate, who hadn't been there. Today, American and European descendants share that same DNA of World War II trauma. We learn of our ancestors' hardships through our family's oral traditions. It's important for us to pass these stories, brief and incomplete as they may be, on to future generations. It is necessary that we not only honor our past, but that we learn from the lessons our ancestors learned the hard way by those who died and lived through World War II. There is a difference between an oral tradition and an oral history. Oral history requires that the one remembering events had to actually have been there themselves. It becomes a historical record and is usually very factual, with events laid out chronologically and with less emphasis on emotion. Oral tradition is a remembrance passed on from generation to generation. There is something deeper and richer in oral traditions, as they often include the pathos as well as the spiciness of life. A family's oral tradition is less about detail and more about the impact of emotional events. Families pass on how past events were perceived and how events affected a family throughout their remembered history. Oral traditions tell us how it changed us, not just how it was.
Well, I believe the past shapes how we understand the present. And if we don't know at least a little about our past, we can't really move forward. But I think we can save time in our journey through life by taking a moment to reflect on the past, on history. That reflection can help us avoid making the same mistakes again. I truly believe it helps us move forward. And then there's also the question of memory. Some families live through tragedies. Some people fought for causes. It would be a shame to forget because those causes mattered. They were important causes. They were important values. Even in today's world, I believe it is important to remind people of the facts and the reasons behind those commitments. Why someone would join the resistance. Why fight against Nazism, fascism. I believe these are important values. Very important.
As I learned of Plélo's experience in the war, I reflected on my own family's experiences. I began to realize that the true grit of a family comes through their oral tradition. What is remembered is what means the most to a family. A family's oral tradition is often just a phrase, a snippet of a long-lost memory. Then it indelibly marks the passage of time. A family's oral tradition is what comes through the generations, not what the historians say happened. It's what the family lived through. Please join me for the next episode of You Were There, Karen Death, when during the Plélo Liberation Festival, others began to share their oral traditions with me. And there were many who did. I felt privileged and wanted to hear more. Not only the dates and names, but the raw emotion of change, the providence that spared one and took another, is the true substance of history.